I'm Jacob Feldman.
And I'm Eben Novy-Williams, and this is the Changing the Stink sports business podcast, the Sporticast. Jacob Feldman, excited to be back from vacation.
Welcome back.
Thank you for keeping the lights on with a great conversation with Julia while I was out. Scott is still out. Good for him for taking a vacation. It's due time for him, but I'm excited to be back in the U.S., Jacob, and excited to be talking to you and changing the stink for folks who don't get the reference.
Well, it's one of those moments where I'm happy that we're recording virtually, because if we were in person, I'd be worried. Did I put deodorant on? Am I the stink? What are we referencing here? Is this some sort of? You could have told me ahead of time, but no. We're far away, so that's not what's going on, right?
Thankfully, the stink is people who are way bigger than us, Jacob. I got out of the Canadian wilderness, opened Twitter, and all I could see on Tuesday night was clips of people talking about Robert Saleh, the coach of the New York Jets, on a Hard Knocks clip, berating his offensive line for struggling after a practice, saying that there's been a stink over the organization for years, and you can have a Hall of Fame quarterback in Aaron Rodgers and really talented running backs and highly paid wide receivers, but none of it matters if the big guys up front aren't blocking and pushing the defensive line in the right ways. You sum this up on Sportico perfectly, so I don't want to spend too much time summarizing your words when we have you. But you said it's a perfect example of why fans love Hard Knocks, and also a perfect example why, if you're an athlete, a coach, or an organization, you don't really love the idea of HBO cameras being around your organization in training camp. And I think you're right on both of those things, and I would love to hear you expand on it.
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it there. Like you said, we're keeping a close eye on Hard Knocks this year because there's been all this conversation around how much access are they going to get. This is obviously a show that built an entire genre of this behind-the-scenes docuseries. And is it going to be able to survive in this world of limited access, in this world where teams themselves are making this kind of content? And so I was, frankly, a little surprised and very excited to see this moment come about midway through Tuesday night's episode, because it is something we don't see on those other channels. All this other content that we're kind of force-fed doesn't include this kind of honest, frank discussion. It's like I said in the story, it's not surprising that the team is recognizing this weakness. You would be shocked if they didn't recognize this one weakness on the roster. And it's not surprising that they're speaking the way they did. You did a great job summarizing what Coach Saleh said without using the select words that he seemed to sprinkle in there every one or two words. But
I edited it, yeah.
Yes, yeah, you did well on that front. And honestly, when I sent in the story, I wasn't even sure how they were going to fix up this quote for publication, but they did a good job on that front. But it's not surprising that's how players and coaches talk. But it is still something we don't see a lot. And so getting to see that was refreshing. And then the rest of the episode, there wasn't that much more of that. There wasn't more behind the scenes. There was not much more on the offensive line at all. We didn't really hear from the linemen. We didn't really hear from the O-line coach. We certainly didn't hear from the general manager talking about, do we need to bring in a free agent? Do we need to make a trade? Do we need to make a move? What's our roster going to look like? Those are discussions going on in press conferences on Twitter, but not in this show. And so I think that's going to be a big challenge for them going forward. And we're going to see, are the Jets comfortable with this level of access even? Are they going to pare it back even further, given the firestorm to some extent around these comments, even if they aren't even that surprising? It's something we're going to have to continue to track now for the rest of the season.
Do you know, if you're an organization on Hard Knocks, do you know what kind of any editorial approval I assume you can tell cameras, hey, you can't be in the room for this, but once something is captured on camera, do you have a sense of how much the league or the team, let alone even individuals, have a chance to be like, that doesn't make it into this episode?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I think it's probably more informal than formal. My sense is, I'm fairly confident that they don't get final cut say, especially because, as you know, with Hard Knocks, these things are being made up until the last minute, so it's not even really practical to have the team review footage inch by inch. I think this is what I'm saying. Like, Hard Knocks decided to show this clip, and that's probably going to change the way players and coaches, the cameramen have to go back the next day to practice. They're there today, Wednesday. So that is probably more where these kinds of things are being mediated and discussed more than after the fact, more than between when the moment happens and when it airs, which I'm guessing is more in NFL films as in ultimately HBO's hands.
So we did an event in LA a month ago. I moderated a panel with Sean McVay, the coach of the Los Angeles Rams. The Rams were on COVID 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago when Sean was the coach. And I asked him, hey, why is it that nobody seems to want to do this?
It's popular. People watch it. You become fans of these players. Sure.
And it seems like it's a nice marketing advantage for your team in some ways, right? And we can get into that. He essentially said three things. He said, number one, every NFL team is hypersensitive about competitive advantage.
Right.
And we don't want a single throwaway clip to have some kind of a cadence or a play call or a personnel alignment.
Yeah, there's plenty of people trying to grab a screen grab of a roster 100%. In the background or anything like that. Yeah.
So that was his first answer. He's like, it just having Hard Knocks increases the opportunity for opponents to find something about your team that you don't want them to know. That makes total sense to me. The second thing he said is that he wondered and worried about, with a camera in the room, are any interactions authentic?
Yeah, and that I thought was the most interesting point. It's something I don't hear as often, but go ahead.
Yeah, so and we can dive into that. There's a third one which we can get into later. But yeah, essentially he was like, if I'm cutting a player, I don't want to worry that like I'm not doing the right thing by me or by him because I know there's cameras rolling. And I wonder if there was no camera there, is that a different speech that he's giving?
Slightly, it has to be, right? I mean, having a camera in your face changes your behavior, whether you're conscious of it or not, to some degree, right? And even just on a larger scale, these training camps are getting shorter and shorter with each CBA. And, coaches talk all the time about bonding and teamwork and getting these teams on the same page. And you could definitely see that getting disrupted, even, just knowing that a player is mic'd up and that's going to affect how everyone else is kind of talking around them. And you're not going to be as honest. And I think that's something that I, again, frankly, had not really thought too much about. But now that once Coach McVay said that, it hit something in my mind as I'm watching this season.
It's funny to me then that we're talking about these shows and Hard Knocks and all these other docuseries as kind of the unfiltered behind the scenes look, and then the people who are in them are worrying that they're not unfiltered and that they're too filtered for what the reality.
Well, there's a whole media studies PhD in there on what reality is and what we see through our screens, but we don't have time for that today. Yeah,
exactly. And then I want to get into the third thing because there's something you mentioned right at the top of the show. The Rams are doing, through their own in-house content studio, a probably lighter version of a Hard Knock style. It's called Behind the Grind. It's their own cameras giving fans of the Rams a chance to peek behind the curtain at things that are going on at training camp and in other places. And Sean mentioned the Final Cut thing and saying, look, this is why I love what we're doing in-house, because I don't have to worry about, again, a competitive advantage thing. They catch something on camera, I know I can go to our guys and get that out, which I thought was an interesting third thing. And that seems, you mentioned the in-house studio stuff, that seems like it is maybe a future to some degree here, right? As a product like Hard Knocks, which is, as we said, extremely popular among a lot of NFL fans. As a league like the NFL struggles to have a single team willing to raise its hand to participate in that, I do wonder if we're going to get into more of what we're seeing in the documentary world, right? Which is the participation of the subject in the actual documentary making process. If that's the future of a lot of this, for better or worse for fans. We're
already seeing that in the NFL. Quarterback, this big show on Netflix, reached number one on the service. Patrick Mahomes is one of the executive producers of that show. He's one of the subjects of that show. So it's NFL Films is already making that decision that, okay, sometimes we're going to have to cut these people in on that process to some degree. I'm watching Hard Knocks, and I'm getting the sense that whether it's next year or in the future, this show is going to have to expand beyond one team because the teams just aren't giving you enough. And so it's a great episode to focus on Aaron Rodgers, but it's not a season. It's a great 15 minutes to go and see where Sauce Gardner came from and his college and his family. But they're not giving you the full arc now and enough behind-the-scenes stuff to last the season. So I'm getting the sense we're just going to get more of those. Like, you can call them puff pieces. They are still journalism, and Hard Knocks is doing this stuff better than anybody else. So to say that Hard Knocks is the same as what these teams are doing is kind of a disservice to what Hard Knocks does. Because even last night there's a 90-second kind of montage of it raining at Panthers practice. And I'm like, wow, like I'm ready for football season. Like I've never put pads on in my life, but I would like to go out there and hit a sled in the rain right now. So Hard Knocks is special, and I think it still can survive if it recognizes kind of what it's good at. But it's not going to be what it had been for that exact reason that teams now can do this themselves and say, we don't need to bring these other cameras in. Almost all of the top teams, the Eagles have a great in-house video department, the Chiefs, the Cowboys, obviously, and they can kind of show you those more profile type mini movies and get you connected with the players without, for better or worse, showing what's actually going on inside a football team.
One of the things that also stands out to me about Hard Knocks, which I think is so effective, is the fact that the distance between that event happening and it airing to the public is actually fairly small. And,
it's miraculous.
So many of these other, you and I have talked about the Tour de France documentary on Netflix, which I loved. That aired 11 and a half months after the events were happening. And one of the actual frustrating things about it is that I watched it with my partner, and we'd watch an episode and she'd be like, "Oh, Fabio Jakobsen, like, how's he doing this year?" And I was like, "Oh, he crashed out a week ago of the current tour." And you're watching,
or even worse, 2 episodes in, you're Googling somebody to see where they're from, and all of a sudden you find out what happens to them, and it's like, okay, well, now the drama's gone. So
and so many of these other Full Swing, the tennis one to a degree, they vary in the time, but the ability, I think, of Hard Knocks for you to see this thing and be like, oh, this happened a couple weeks ago or a week ago, however long the actual gap is.
2 days.
And it makes it so easy, I think, for fans of the sport to be like, oh, if you're a Jets fan, I think you maybe remember that joint practice with the Panthers when the O-line was really struggling. And that seems incredibly valuable to me. And again, it does make me sad if this is kind of a dying art in some ways, or if there's just fatigue about, and maybe that's a good transition, because the sports docuseries has been one of the big sports media trend stories of the past 18 months. And I personally am feeling a bit of fatigue about the concept of them, but I'm curious if you are seeing that. The quarterback you just said was #1 on Netflix in the US, right? So obviously a tremendous success for Netflix, and probably all 3 of the quarterbacks that were featured there. But but do you see fatigue here, and is in-house production the way around that? Is it athlete-led production? What do you think is the solution there?
Fatigue I think it's more understanding of the ceiling here. Not everything is going to be Drive to Survive. Not every sport is going to get the same bump that F1 got. And I think I've been fairly consistent in saying the growth of F1, maybe the Netflix show was necessary for it, but was not sufficient. There's a lot going on behind the scenes. There's a lot in terms of, it was a crazy year in competition between the 2 top teams, Red Bull and Lewis Hamilton, that was driving a lot of that narrative. There's a lot going on. You can't just bring in a camera behind the scenes and all of a sudden your sport is a worldwide sensation. So I think that is a big part of it. I feel, I guess, a little differently than you. I'm still hungry. We were going back to cycling. Like, that was something that wasn't really on my radar. I checked it out. I loved it. I watched probably 40 hours of Tour de France coverage over the next month. I don't know. I personally, just today, Wednesday, Netflix announced they're going to do one on sprinters around the world.
Love that.
Yeah, like I'll watch that next year. We'll watch people in Jamaica and Italy and the U.S., people who are 19, 20, trying to achieve their dreams, overcoming injuries. If you have, it's super simple, but if you have a compelling story, compelling characters, I think there's still a lot more demand for this stuff, especially for these sports that we're not already inundated with coverage of. And even in the NFL, the big question for me, I think it's going to come out next year, is this Cowboys documentary that Netflix paid something on the order of $50 million for. And that's going to really, I think, be a big proving point for this genre. Is that really going to be, is it going to be the last dance? The Cowboys are as big, as we say every year when the valuations come out, the biggest brand in sports in the world. Are people really interested enough to watch several hours on a team from 30 years ago, much less 1 year ago? So we'll see. I still think there's a lot of demand there if you can find the right people, the right story, and the right access to tell the story.
I've told this story on the podcast, but I'm pulling a Scott here by retelling a story. But I think it was long enough ago that maybe some of our listeners haven't heard it. But the best piece of behind-the-scenes sports content I think I've ever seen was, at this point, maybe 8 years ago, when one of the Daniel Cormier, John Jones UFC fights was canceled because John Jones had failed a drug test. They had cameras behind Dana White when he went into Daniel's camp and told him the fight was off because John had failed another test. And Cormier breaks down in tears immediately, and he ends up hugging Dana White. They have this very tender moment
Yeah.
where Dana's like, this sucks and it's not your fault. And you just see all of the work that Cormier had put in. And this is one of the baddest mans on the planet, right? This is a huge fighting force. It's amazing. And it gave me...
and that's perfect proof of what these shows can do, right?
100%.
If you capture the moment, that there's no fatigue for moments like that.
Yeah, but there is, again, going back to what we're talking about, I do think that I have no idea how Daniel feels about this, but there is, athletes don't really want to seem vulnerable in those situations, right? And another one that you and I talk about a lot, I think everyone does, is when Sam Darnold said he was seeing ghosts during that
was a
primetime
sure.
game.
Monday Night Football.
That is a moment where it's so compelling for fans. You're seeing it essentially in real time because it was caught during the game and aired during the Jets game.
Right.
But there were changes, from what I understand, there were changes made after that to make sure that an athlete couldn't get embarrassed like that when he was mic'd up again. And that to me is the hardest part here, is that there is this push and pull between exactly the thing that fans want is also seems to be exactly the thing that athletes and teams and leagues don't want to provide to fans.
Right. I think there will always be enough athletes or leagues that want more attention and are willing to turn over access to get it. And that's basically the position F1 was in. As everyone remembers, the top teams didn't participate that first year, but once they saw the impact, then they got on board. And so I still think that you're right. We're not going to see the top athletes totally raw all the time. You think about like the Tom versus Time documentary with Tom Brady, that wasn't as elucidating as some other stuff is. So it is kind of that spectrum of the more famous somebody is, the less access you're going to get. And it's just a matter of kind of hitting that threshold on the graph there to reach that interesting level. And I do think, maybe not fatigue, but I do think there's a skepticism each time these shows come out. It's kind of like a prove it to me that this isn't just PR. This is going to be worth my time. I'm going to actually learn something. And shows need to match that or answer that skepticism to break through these days.
Okay, so let's move on. New topic. You put on Twitter last week soliciting questions for when you were on the Sporticast this week. I had one that I know you and Julia didn't get to on Monday, so I'm going to ask it to you now. MLS, a golden goose, a goat, if you will, fell into MLS lap golden in the middle of this season. Leo Messi has been lighting it up in the Leagues Cup for Inter Miami, about to start playing in MLS. I'm curious how you would grade or what you think MLS has done well, maybe what you think they could have improved on in terms of capitalizing on the absolute sensation that is Leo Messi coming to play in the U.S. For Inter Miami. I
would say overall they've exceeded my expectations. Probably, I think I would, I'd give them, probably an A- or something if I had to give them a grade for how this has gone. And I think the Apple deal is a big part of this. And the biggest thing I think they could have done and have done is just get this everywhere. They and this is a benefit of the Apple deal too, is the highlights aren't geo-blocked like a lot of soccer highlights are. They're going worldwide. They're on everywhere you can see it. Apple TV, the platform, has kind of turned into a billboard for MLS and Messi. They've pushed that. They can't push that any harder than they're pushing it. I'm getting notifications. I think I'm sure within MLS there's more that they, wish they were doing or could do. You look at, the Apple stores themselves. Could they somehow get some sort of, real estate impact here? I don't know what Times Square looks like. I'm sure they're doing stuff. You can always, do more marketing, but I think they've done a substantial amount. I haven't looked at, search trends or things like that, but for anybody who wasn't aware of what Miami is, or because I think that was there's a lot of sports fans in America that could not tell you Inter Miami existed, right, 2 months ago. I'm guessing that number is very, very small at this point, and that I think had to be the goal a month in. And we can kind of get into like the revenue side of it and ticket sales and shirts and stuff. But for me, if I was approaching this opportunity, I'm not looking at this year. This year to me is all about awareness. It's about building the system, the foundation, the expectation. And then I think you can worry about revenue down the line once these people are fans or once these people are committed to following this team, this league, this sport. But right now it's just getting it out there and getting as many people aware as possible.
Yeah, I do wonder how I do think the manner in which you get awareness does matter a little bit. And you mentioned the highlights in there, and you can watch every Messi goal for free 90 seconds after it's scored, maybe even less. The league has done, I think you're right, they've done a great job of pushing that out, making it available immediately. There does, to me at least, seem to be another edge to that sword in some ways, where I do wonder if there's people out there who are maybe would have paid for the Apple product to watch Messi, who are now like, oh, I could just be on Twitter during an Inter Miami game. And I wrote something about this for Sporticast a couple weeks ago, but when Messi scored that free kick goal in his first match, which was one of the most shocking, amazing actual on-field sporting events I think I've watched live. I was getting texts about that from people who were not watching it live, but we all reacted together, right? The gap between me watching live and having my mind blown and a friend of mine watching on Twitter and having his mind blown was so incredibly small that it felt almost meaningless in some ways. And I do wonder if you're conditioning people to get the Messi experience at zero cost to them and at relatively small revenue for the league or for Inter Miami, if at some point you do run the risk of actually not capitalizing to the full extent of you might have if you had decided to do something differently.
Yeah, it's a funneling question, right? Are you trying to attract the people who would love to watch Messi but don't know they would love to watch Messi? Or are you trying to attract people who know they want to watch Messi but don't know if they want to pay for Apple TV?
Yes.
So if you're trying to get this, I would go after that first audience because it's a lot bigger, right? People who are sports fans who in July and August, there's not that much on if you're not dedicated to baseball every day. And you're saying, hey, there's an amazing thing happening in soccer like twice a week. And we know you're not going to spend the money or download the apps to watch it ahead of time, but here's what you missed, and you missed it again. And on Thursday, you don't have to miss it. You can be there. And so that would be my progression. And I think that's the path they're taking. And we'll see over time, how much they're maybe limiting the highlights or delaying them or what have you. But I again, that to me is a discussion to be having next year, not next week. And the other thing they are doing is, they announced they're going to have, I think, 2 separate kind of behind the scenes, going back to our first conversation, docuseries following Messi, one during the World Cup and one during this MLS season. So it's going to be, I would not be hoarding, Messi. I would be sharing Messi and then I'd be figuring out how to work from there.
Yeah, it's like a question of whether you think of free highlights as a marketing tool or a business driving tool. And to be clear, essentially every sport in the U.S. at least has taken the former approach for the past 10 years.
Or been dragged there eventually.
Or been dragged there, yeah. And maybe that changes at some point. Another thing that kind of stuck out to me, and I didn't look at this much past his first couple games, but Apple, at least on a lot of social media, seemed to be deferring a lot of this to MLS. So to use the example of Messi's free kick goal, Apple didn't tweet about that at all. They retweeted MLS's tweet. They seem to be essentially allowing the league to disseminate those Apple highlights in the way that it wanted to, and maybe boosting them when it could. But that surprised me because I'm used to in other leagues, I feel like there's something big happens, and then immediately it's like the league and the partner on their own channels are both pushing the same thing. They both have rights to it, obviously.
Right.
And there seems to be either by Apple's, I doubt this is in the contract, but unwillingness, disinterest, or their deferral to MLS, this relationship actually seems like it is really just MLS controlling and disseminating, as opposed to both of them kind of doing either competing against each other or just amplifying each other in some different way. Yeah,
that's a fascinating distinction to notice, thing to track. Like, I'm even just wondering, how many MLS highlights ESPN tweeted last year compared to Apple TV. I'd be interested to look at the difference. And I think it gets to, I mean, the structure of this deal is very different than most media deals. And it's, it's a conversation we can have. It's obviously something that came up around the Pac-12, but a conversation we could have about MLS owns this product a lot more than most leagues own their media. I mean, they're in a lot of cases producing this content. They're distributing it with Apple, but it's an MLS product. And I'm guessing MLS likes it that way, that this kind of gives them, I don't know about leverage, but control to some degree. And as you build up those marketing channels, because they also care about ticketing and merchandise and some things that Apple maybe doesn't care about. So who owns that fan relationship, I think, is a really fascinating distinction as we kind of evolve this media situation.
It does kind of make me wonder. I think if you're a sports league and you partner with ESPN, one of the main things you want is the ancillary
megaphone.
promotionary megaphone things. I think if you're a sports league and you partner with Apple, I think that the megaphone looks a little different, right? It's
totally.
Put the stadiums on Apple Maps. It's Apple
Right.
Music and Apple Podcasting. Maybe a little of Apple News, boosting depending on where someone is reading and who their local MLS team is. It does make me wonder if, in some ways, if depending on who your partner is, the way in which you want them, in addition to showing live games, the way in which you want them promoting what you guys are doing probably varies dramatically by who that partner is that's sitting across the table from you.
Yeah, and I think it's also just how fandom is evolving. People are going to follow MLS. They're not going to follow ESPN. I think people are fans of one rather than the other. It's the way these platforms work. It's a really big conversation, and it's interesting to see it evolve. But I like the idea of leagues owning this content as much as they can. So
my theory on just to go back to the highlights for a second, I envision this future where let's just say the NBA. The NBA goes to its TV partners and is like, look, this new round of TV deals, you're not allowed to tweet these highlights within 30 minutes of them happening. And the NBA also saying, we're probably not going to do this either, and seeing if they can sell a flash highlight package, right? Where there's a single Twitter account, there's a single news organization that gets the ability to, across all of its channels, own all these things. So when LeBron has a crazy dunk on a TNT game, there may be someone else that's allowed exclusive access to that highlight for a certain amount of time before NBA.com and TNT and Turner decide to do all of their things with it. Is that, when you hear that idea, is that an insane idea? is that maybe a potential future? Am I missing something big there? I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
I think it gets to this foundational question that you identified of just what is the purpose of these things. And to me, I mean, these things being highlights, these things being sports teams, like the incremental revenue you're getting from that is not worth the risk of turning people off from being aware of your content, of being fans of your teams and leagues and athletes. And that's how I feel about a lot of decisions that these teams are making. Is I would be thinking on a 5-year, 25-year horizon, not a 1-3 year. What does this deal look like? And I also think there's a practicality element of it. Of okay, if all of a sudden you're going to have to be like policing everybody's feeds and taking stuff down, and then you look like the bad guy, and people are just trying to be fans. And I think it gets messy pretty quick too, with a Y, not an I. So that would be my pushback to it. Yeah,
it's interesting. One of the biggest, it may even have been the biggest, when I look back at all those, again, going back to that first free kick, because I did a lot of research around that one. I believe the Bleacher Report tweet, which used the MLS video, and I don't know what proper citation is, but made it clear that they had taken the video from MLS.
Right.
I believe that got more impressions, I think, than the actual MLS itself video did, even though it's the same video, and there was some attribution there. But it kind of made me wonder if in a world where only Bleacher had that initial video, and sure, there's going to be people pirating it, but that video is going to, in my opinion, going to spread around the internet immediately anyway, right? Like, people are just going to retweet the Bleacher Report one, and then that becomes the one everybody's sharing. And I do wonder if Bleacher
Report is selling like ads on that. How, what is Bleacher Report getting out of that?
Sure, or they're getting a huge following base who understands that, like, when something big happens in these games, like, that's where I'm going to get to see it first, right? I don't know. Again, I'm just thinking out loud here, but I do. Yeah. It does feel like so much of the media experience has been monetized by sports teams and monetized extremely effectively by leagues like the NBA and the NFL. Yeah. And then this one feels like it is something that is kind of in this weird nether region of.
It's beautiful. It's utopian. It's competition. It's like, how quickly can I get this video out? How high quality can I do it? I want to be known for my curating of if you wanted the best sports moments, it's here. And people built entire businesses on this, and I would hate to kind of lose all that.
To be clear, yeah, I think if this does become a reality, I do think it may be worse for sports fans out there. Before we go, Jacob, we're getting to the end of the Women's World Cup. 2 teams left as we record this: England and Spain meeting in the World Cup final. You were in Australia a few weeks ago, got to go to a few Women's World Cup games. I would love to hear your thoughts as someone who's been to sporting events in the U.S. quite a bit. Anything you took away from the on-the-ground experience at the World Cup this year?
Sure. Well, first off, I'm glad we're discussing this, because I'm going to, after this podcast ends, I'm going to go and expense my trip to Australia. So this is perfect.
There you go. Yeah.
Appreciate that. No, it was a ton of fun. I hadn't been to a previous Women's World Cup. I haven't been to a Men's World Cup, so points of comparison are somewhat limited. But I was pretty impressed. The stadiums were full to both games I went to, neither of which featured Australia or was really a marquee game. The first one was Germany, Morocco. Second one was Panama, France, and Sydney. We spent several nights at the fan zone, which I was pretty impressed by again, where you could watch all the games. A lot of Colombian fans there, a lot more Colombian Australians than I had realized. But yeah, overall, I mean, you could tell that there was a big event happening, which I think is really cool for a Women's World Cup and bodes well for the future of these events, both in terms of, I think people are going to want to host this and also in terms of where the sport is headed.
Certainly it helps, I think, at least after you left, it helped to have the Australian team make a deep run. I think that's...
Of course, that's the biggest thing at all, yeah.
And just to bring this more centric to the U.S. for a second,
Mm-hmm.
NWSL obviously experiencing a ton of commercial growth. The Red Stars earlier this week are about to sell to a group led by Laura Ricketts for $35.5 million.
Mm-hmm.
NWSL had a lot of players in the World Cup, concentrated largely on the U.S., Canada, and Brazilian teams, none of whom I think performed up to the expectations of themselves or their fans. But it will be interesting to me to see what the kind of result is for the domestic league here in the U.S. When typically you have a U.S. team that's coming back with a bit of hardware, and they are
doing a tour and a whole thing, and people are
it's going to be a very different vibe for those U.S. players coming back to NWSL this year. And also just the fact that if you were an avid fan of women's soccer and were following this tournament, there's not a ton of NWSL players that were playing deep into it, again, which is a huge departure from even what it was like 4 years ago.
And so I think even more concerning is that this final, England and Spain, those are the two biggest competitors in terms of domestic leagues to what we have here, right? So on the one hand, there's disappointment here and there's lack of enthusiasm. On the other hand, those countries are both, whichever one wins especially, but I think both of them are going to see a dramatic boost. We saw even, I think just in the last year or 18 months, the benefit in England of the Euros run they made and kind of the impact that had across Europe as well. I think, an England win is probably a worst case scenario for U.S. soccer, I would have to imagine. But either way, I mean, Spain has been investing in this area as long as anybody as well. So it's going to be very interesting to watch over these next couple of years how the NWSL, how American soccer regroups, reinvests. And honestly, I think in the long term, it could be good for the state of U.S. soccer. I think things felt, even going into the World Cup, a little unstable, a little rickety. I think you could see kind of signs of, okay, maybe we need to go back and address some things. And if they had won, and if they had, some of these older players had kind of the going out party that they expected, maybe that would have covered up some of the deeper issues that we have around the sport, around investment, around youth levels. And so maybe this can kind of push us forward again for another run like we've had the last 10 years. And especially what's going on in England and Spain is reason for investment as well.
Scott and I talked with Haley Rosen, the founder of Just Women's Sports, a few weeks ago about this exact topic, about the rise of talent and money swirling around in European women's club soccer and what that means for the dominance that the NWSL has had. European women's pro soccer has no salary cap, and the NWSL does, right? A huge difference. Another big difference, the NWSL, like American soccer leagues, starts in the spring and ends in the fall.
Right.
And pretty much every European league does the opposite, starts in the fall and ends in the spring, which creates a very weird overlap of transfer windows and players who are thinking about moving from one to the other or back from Europe back to the U.S., whatever it is. I would expect there to be some changes both around salary cap and scheduling in the next few years as the major leagues or the major continental groups start to realize that maybe aligning a bit is going to make it better for fans, make it better for players, make it better for themselves as well. But I'm fascinated by the women's soccer, the business growth they're seeing, and the role that a brand like we talked about this with Haley as well.
I'm glad you mentioned this,
because the role that Chelsea and Man United have.
It brings it all back together,
brands.
right? Yeah, because they have these massive international followings, and they can push these highlights, and they can turn these players into stars because they've developed these kind of relationships with fans. Is something that I'm sure every American owner is envious of.
Jacob, this has been very fun. Maybe Scott will get stuck into Bruvnik for another week, and we will we'll
take
get
your
to
time,
run
Scott.
this back.
Yeah, no rush.
We'll get to run this back next week. He is Jacob Feldman on Twitter at JacobFeldman4. I am Eben Novy-Williams on Twitter at Novy_Williams. Sporticast is produced by Keith Zanardi and Aaron Greenewald. Thank you to both of them. Sportico's digital media editor Cora Veltman would like you to know that you can follow the Sporticast at Sporticast, which is the hub of the Sportico Media Network.